The first time the water came down, I blamed the weather. Second time, I blamed bad luck. By the third storm, standing ankle-deep in muddy water behind my equipment shed at 2 in the morning with a flashlight in one hand and my blood pressure somewhere around 1,000, I realized somebody upstream had made a decision, and that decision had my name written all over it. See, I've lived outside Belridge, Tennessee most of my life, out on 8 acres my dad bought back in the late 70s when land was still cheap and people minded their own business. It wasn't fancy land, nothing you'd put in a magazine, just rolling pasture, a little creek line, a red barn that leaned more every year no matter how many times I swore I'd fix it, but it was ours. Quiet too. At least it used to be. Then about a year earlier, some development company out of Nashville bought the ridge uphill from me and announced they were building Belridge Commons, which is basically what happens when a corporate planner looks at a cow pasture and sees a Starbucks. Whole thing went up fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen out there. 1 month, it was bulldozers. Next month, there were giant concrete slabs, steel beams, bright orange fencing, and men in neon vests everywhere acting like they personally invented dirt. Folks around town were excited at first. New jobs, new stores, higher property values. Same speech every small town gets right before it stops feeling like itself. I didn't say much about it because honestly, I figured progress was going to progress whether I liked it or not. But what I didn't know then was that every inch of that place had been graded like a giant funnel, and my property sat right at the bottom of it. After that third rain, I walked my fence line at sunrise and immediately noticed the grass was gone near the east boundary, completely stripped away like somebody pressure washed the earth itself. Water was still moving across my field in a steady sheet. Not random runoff either. It had direction, speed. My lower pasture looked like a shallow pond, and my old Labrador, Hank, wouldn't even walk through it. Just stood there staring at me like, "You seeing this too?" So I followed the water uphill. That's when I found the concrete channel. Fresh poured, clean edges, huge drain pipe feeding directly toward my property line like they hadn't even bothered hiding it. I remember standing there in muddy boots, just staring at it while rainwater rushed past me, and I actually laughed for a second because it was so absurd. They really did it. They built an entire shopping center and decided my land was cheaper than proper drainage. Next morning, I drove up to the leasing office. Place smelled like fresh paint and expensive candles, the kind of office where nobody's desk has actual paperwork on it. The property manager, a woman named Claire Donovan, met me with this polished little corporate smile that disappeared the second she realized I wasn't there to congratulate her on the ribbon cutting. I explained what was happening, and she listened with her hands folded like a therapist dealing with an unstable patient. Then she hit me with, "Well, Mr. Grady, water follows natural flow patterns." Natural. That word bothered me more than it should have. I looked at her and said, "Ma'am, there ain't nothing natural about a 40-foot concrete drain pipe." She smiled again, thinner this time. The site was engineered and approved by the county. That's corporate language for not my problem. I drove home angry, but not yelling angry. Worse. Quiet angry. The kind where your brain starts connecting dots whether you want it to or not. That night, I dug through county records online with a whiskey glass beside me and Hank snoring on the floor. Took me about 3 hours before I found the original grading plans filed by the developer. And there it was. 2 retention ponds. Large ones. Designed specifically to prevent runoff from leaving the property during storms. Only problem was, they didn't exist. I zoomed in 3 separate times thinking maybe I missed something. Nope. According to the plans, those ponds should have been sitting uphill from me catching thousands of gallons of water. Instead, all that runoff was pouring straight onto my field. I sat there staring at the screen while the rain tapped against the windows, and I remember this strange feeling settling over me. Not shock exactly, clarity. Because at that moment I understood something real simple. This wasn't an accident. Somebody had looked at the numbers, looked at the cost of building proper drainage, then looked downhill at my land and figured, let the farmer deal with it. And the part that really got under my skin wasn't even the flooding. It was how certain they were that nobody like me would push back. Now, if you've never dealt with county offices before, let me save you some time. Nobody moves fast unless money is bleeding or cameras are rolling. I started making calls the next morning anyway. First to the county engineering department, then environmental compliance, then eventually a civil engineer named Marty Raines who sounded like he'd been disappointed by humanity for at least 40 straight years. Marty came out 2 days later in an old white pickup covered in faded company decals and spent maybe 20 minutes walking my property before he stopped near the fence line, squatted down in the mud, poked at the soil with a pen, and said, "Well, this is bad." Which, weirdly enough, made me feel better because at least somebody besides me finally said it out loud. We walked uphill together toward the commercial site, and once he saw the drainage channels feeding toward my pasture, he actually laughed under his breath. Not a happy laugh either. More like the kind a mechanic makes when somebody tells him they fixed an engine with duct tape and prayer. He asked if the retention ponds from the plans had ever been built. I told him no. He shook his head slowly and said, "Then somebody signed off on shortcuts." That word stayed with me. Shortcuts. Such a harmless-sounding word for something that was actively destroying my property. Marty helped me file formal complaints with the county, and to their credit, they did respond, eventually. Problem was, eventually doesn't stop floodwater. Another storm rolled in before any inspector even scheduled a visit. I'll never forget that night because it was the first time I genuinely got scared. Rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown by God himself. Around midnight, I stepped onto my porch with a flashlight and saw water creeping toward the driveway. My shed was already surrounded. The lower field looked like a lake under the lightning flashes, and every few minutes another wave would surge through the drainage channel uphill like somebody dumping buckets into it. I stood there soaked to the bone, realizing if this kept up another season, I'd lose the barn, maybe part of the house foundation too. And here's the thing people don't understand until it happens to them. When somebody keeps pushing your boundaries, physically or otherwise, eventually your brain stops asking, "Why are they doing this?" and starts asking, "How do I stop it?" That's when the idea hit me. Not all at once. More like pieces sliding together. The next morning I called Marty again and asked a very specific question. If water naturally stays on my property, can I legally retain it? Long silence. Then he chuckled. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" 3 weeks later, I had permits for what the county classified as an agricultural water retention feature. Sounds fancy. Truth is, it was basically a giant basin dug along the edge of my property where all their runoff entered. Wide, shallow, ugly as sin, but completely legal. I hired a local excavation crew, and man, the gossip around town started immediately. Belridge is the kind of place where people treat a new mailbox like breaking news. By day 2 of construction, folks at the diner were already saying I was building a moat. Old man Curtis at the gas station asked if I was preparing for medieval combat. Even my sister called asking why Facebook suddenly thought I'd become some anti-government survivalist. But Claire from the retail complex? Oh, she noticed real quick. She pulled up in a white SUV while the excavators were still working and stepped out wearing heels that sank straight into the mud, which honestly felt symbolic somehow. She walked over with that same tight corporate smile and asked what exactly I was building. I told her, flood protection. She looked past me at the basin and said, "You understand altering drainage could affect nearby businesses." I remember wiping sweat off my forehead and saying, "Funny, that sounds familiar." Her expression changed right there. Tiny shift, but noticeable. Like for the first time she realized I wasn't just some irritated landowner writing complaint emails anymore. A week later the basin was finished. Then we waited. Storm came the following Sunday afternoon. Big one too. Heavy spring rain, nonstop for hours. Around dusk, I drove my ATV down near the basin with a thermos of coffee and just watched. Water started pouring from the commercial drainage pipes exactly like before, except this time it didn't spread across my pasture. It collected. Slowly at first, then faster. The basin filled beautifully, honestly. Better than I expected. Marty stood beside me in a rain jacket watching the water levels rise like a proud father at a graduation ceremony. Then around hour 3, it happened. The basin reached capacity. And because gravity works both ways when you stop giving water an easy target, it backed up. Not onto my field. Uphill. Back toward Belridge Commons. We could actually see water pooling near the rear loading docks from where we stood. Marty lowered his binoculars and quietly said, "Well, there's your retention pond." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. By Monday morning, half the service road behind the shopping center looked like a swamp. Delivery trucks were struggling to back in. Employees were posting videos online. Somebody uploaded footage of customers hopping through puddles outside a home goods store while a shopping cart floated past in the background like a scene from a low-budget apocalypse movie. And because karma apparently enjoys dramatic timing, another storm hit 3 days later before they figured anything out. That one flooded part of the main parking lot. Not deep enough to damage cars, but enough to become a public embarrassment. Belridge folks are polite until traffic gets inconvenienced. Then suddenly everyone becomes a revolutionary. Complaints exploded online. One restaurant had to close early because water started pushing against the kitchen entrance. The local Facebook groups turned into a war zone overnight. Half the town blamed the developers for poor planning. The other half blamed me for causing flooding. That part still makes me laugh. As if the water magically belonged to me now just because I refused to absorb it anymore. Claire called me during the second flood. No greeting. No fake politeness, just immediate tension in her voice. Your basin is interfering with commercial operations. I was sitting on my porch watching rain hit the trees when she said that, and I remember smiling before answering. No, ma'am, your water is interfering with your operations. Dead silence. Then she said something that told me exactly how nervous they'd become. The city may view this as retaliatory. Retaliatory. There it was. They knew. I leaned back in my chair and said, everything on my property was permitted, inspected, and approved. Same as your project, right? She hung up after that. 2 days later, county inspectors finally showed up during active rainfall. 4 of them standing in ponchos beside the drainage channels taking measurements while water backed into the shopping center behind them like nature itself was presenting evidence. One inspector kept flipping between my copies of the original site plans and the actual drainage setup in front of him with this increasingly confused look on his face. Finally, he asked, where exactly are the retention ponds listed here? Nobody from the development team answered him. They just stood there soaked and miserable while water pooled around their expensive shoes. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because until then, I'd been the problem resident. The stubborn guy making noise. But standing there in the rain with inspectors staring at missing infrastructure worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Suddenly, I wasn't the problem anymore. I was proof. About a week after the inspection, I got a knock at my front door around 7 in the evening. Not Claire this time. This was the real money. Guy named Victor Hale, one of the lead developers behind Belridge Commons. Mid-50s maybe, expensive boots that had clearly never seen actual work, calm voice, silver watch that probably cost more than my tractor. But I'll give him credit. Unlike everybody else so far, he didn't walk onto my property pretending we were both stupid. He stood on my porch while the sky turned orange behind the trees and said, Mr. Grady, I think we should talk honestly. Which is usually what people say right before they try to buy your silence. I invited him in any way. My kitchen still smelled like coffee and wet soil from the storm earlier that day. Hank immediately walked over, sniffed Victor once, then left the room entirely, which honestly should have saved us both some time. Victor sat at my table looking around at the old family photos on the walls like he was studying a culture he didn't fully understand. Then he sighed and said, This situation has become difficult. I almost laughed. Difficult. That word felt real generous considering my lower pasture looked like a war crime every time it rained. He explained that construction costs had climbed during development, timelines got compressed, subcontractors made changes in the field, approvals got delayed. All the usual corporate smoke people use when they want accountability to sound accidental. Then finally he admitted it. Not directly, of course. Men like Victor never confess cleanly. But he said enough. The retention ponds had been postponed during final construction phases to save time and cash flow. Temporary drainage rerouting was supposed to handle runoff for the short term. Problem was, temporary became permanent once the stores opened and revenue started flowing. Because shutting businesses down to rebuild infrastructure after opening, that costs real money. And apparently they figured it would be cheaper to let one guy downhill deal with the consequences. Victor folded his hands and said, No one anticipated the runoff volume would create this level of conflict. Conflict. Another pretty word. I looked out my kitchen window toward the dark field behind the barn and said quietly, You mean damage? He didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than anything else could have. Then came the offers. First it was money. More money than I expected too. Enough to regrade my field, repair erosion, maybe even renovate the barn completely. 10 years earlier, I probably would have taken it without hesitation. But sitting there listening to him talk, I realized something had changed in me over those past months. This wasn't just about repairs anymore. It was about the fact that people with enough money genuinely believe inconvenience only matters when it reaches their own property line. I told him no. Victor nodded like he expected that answer and moved to phase 2. They'd maintain my basin themselves, install pumps if necessary, essentially turn my land into part of their drainage system with compensation attached. Again, no. Then he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long second before asking, "What exactly do you want here, Mr. Grady?" And honestly, that question hit harder than he probably intended, because by then I'd spent so much time fighting the situation I hadn't fully stopped to answer it for myself. I thought about my father teaching me fence repair out by the creek when I was 12. About my mother planting tomatoes behind the barn every summer. About how land changes when people stop respecting it and start calculating it. Finally, I told him the truth. I want your water handled where it lands. Simple as that. No speeches. No dramatic threats. Just responsibilities staying attached to the people creating the problem. Victor rubbed his jaw for a while after that. Then he said rebuilding the drainage system would be extremely expensive now that construction was complete. I remember looking him dead in the eye and saying, "Seems like it was expensive the first time too. You just sent the bill downhill." That one landed. You could see it in his face. Another storm rolled through Belridge 2 nights later before negotiations finished. And this time the flooding at Belridge Commons got bad enough that 3 stores closed early. Videos spread everywhere online. One clip showed water pouring across the parking lot while somebody in the background yelled, "Should have built the damn ponds," which, I'm not gonna lie, became my favorite piece of local cinema. Public pressure changed everything fast after that. Funny how quickly solutions appear once embarrassment enters the room. 2 days later, Victor called me personally. They agreed to reconstruct both retention ponds exactly as originally approved, install underground stormwater storage beneath part of the parking area, redirect all runoff internally, and fully restore my damaged acreage at their expense. Real restoration too, not cosmetic cleanup. Soil replacement, regrading, new grass, drainage repair, everything. Work started less than a month later. And I'll admit, watching excavators tear up sections of that shiny new parking lot to install infrastructure they should have built in the first place felt deeply satisfying in a way that's probably not spiritually healthy. By the following spring, my lower field finally looked normal again. Grass came back thick. The creek settled. Even the old barn somehow looked less tired. Sometimes I'd stand out there at sunset with Hank beside me and just listen to the quiet coming back. But here's the part people still argue about around Belridge. Some folks think I went too far. They say I intentionally caused flooding to force the developer's hand. Others say I simply refused to keep sacrificing my property so a corporation could save money. Truth is, maybe both are a little true. I didn't create the water. I just stopped pretending it was my responsibility. And honestly, that's the part that still sticks with people. Because once someone decides they're done quietly absorbing damage for everybody else, the whole system suddenly gets uncomfortable. So I want to know what you think. If somebody else's problem keeps spilling into your life, at what point do you stop being reasonable and start pushing back? Was I protecting my land? Or escalating the fight on purpose? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors, developers, hosts, or anybody else who thought their convenience mattered more than your home, hit subscribe. Because trust me, these stories are a lot more common than people think.